All right, welcome to the Sake Brewing Seminars. We're going to jump right in today. No updates, no nothing. I had a whole bunch of stuff planned, no time. We got a bit of a long program. There's a lot to cover. Today's topic is building a sake quality program. Our guest today is Nick Lowry, who is the lead brewer at Moto E in Minnesota.
Um,
Um,
Hi, Nick. How you doing?
Hello,
Uh,
I'm doing
Nick,
great.
Nick is a Virgo. he, he wants you to know that he would eat pizza for most meals if possible, and also he cannot juggle. Ladies and gentlemen, he's not available, so just keep that in mind.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
I want to thank you for being here. Um, we're really excited. Motoe has been such a huge player in the game for so long and has had such a major impact on so many of us, especially given the fact that you ran that mill for so many years. And we can't thank you enough for getting us all into that game, especially home brewers who were wanting that shot. So thank you so much. Um,
um,
if you
If
would
you wouldn't mind, would you tell us maybe a little bit about yourself and just how did you get into sake? How did this become a thing for you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I failed out of clown college. The practical just was a disaster. Ever since the incident, never pick up a bowling pin again. Um, so studied food science at the University of Minnesota, and I've been in food and beverage kind of my whole life. My first job was working for my mom at her cheese shop in Delhi. So left school hoping to stay in that field. Was doing some like food safety consulting work, and that was great. But as I progressed, I became more and more of a middleman, looking at spreadsheets, sitting at a desk all day, which was absolutely not what I had hoped for, and it was really not my vibe. So one summer, I had just had enough of looking at the cells on Excel and wiped my hands and said, I'm out of here. I had been homebrewing for a long time, but for a bunch of different reasons, I had considered pursuing it professionally, beer brewing, but it just didn't make financial sense at the time.
Mm.
Um, so I thought, I'll take this summer. I'll just get a job in the service industry. I'll kind of make ends meet while I like regroup, figure out a plan. Where's my next career? And so at the time, I happened to be a regular here at Moto E. My now brother-in-law used to run open mics here on the second floor every Tuesday. So I'd be here drinking, hanging out with friends, and I thought these are great people. I'll come work here. I know the vibe. I know I'll fit in.
Yeah.
Started applying to bring professional brewing programs like UC Davis, that kind of thing.
Mm.
And at the end of the summer, fall comes around. I'm still here, and it turns out that they actually need help in the sake brewery. And I mean, from there, it's like, well, this will be much more practical and informative and unique than any master's program, and someone will actually pay me instead of me paying through the nose. So
Right, right.
um, uh, that's when I decided to take the leap and join the team. And 7 years later, here I am talking to you.
That's
So
amazing.
Lucas, you have my brother-in-law to thank for us meeting and talking. I'll make sure to let him know.
Yeah, please do. I owe him a handshake at some point, to be at the very least. I mean, 7 years is a long time. I don't think people realize how much, like, as much as that flies by. I'm sure that went by for you in a split second, but
Some
at
days it
least
feels
in
like
some
millennia,
cases.
but
Yeah, yeah. But you look back on it, you're like, wow, this is like just yesterday. But it really is a fantastic amount of time, um, especially considering that it's a relative thing, right? I mean, there's a lot of breweries that have only been open for 1, 2 years, so it's a big deal. Um, During that time, what is something that you've learned as a brewer, sake brewer or other, that changed how you thought? Well, I guess about the sake making process. So, as a sake brewer, um, what changed? What changed for you as you learned about this more? That if you look back on it, then you would be like, boy, I would have wanted to know that, or maybe just something that's more interesting to you now.
um, yeah, I don't know that there's like a specific tidbit that I've learned, or I'm like, wow, that's blowing my mind. I mean, there's a lot of things like that have come up, but
Right.
I think the thing that continues to surprise me even to this day, is I'm used to, from my education and background, there being like a right way.
Mm.
And then the more I learn in the sake industry, it's that idea of Banryu that everyone talks about, that like
Right, right,
everyone
right.
is doing it differently. And like everyone has the thing where like this is the most important thing and there is a right way to do it. But everyone's answer is different. Even the people
Yeah,
that agree on what's most important have, are all over the place,
yeah,
um, which is a little terrifying in some senses, that you like, I'll never stop learning. I'll never understand everything there is, but then also a little bit liberating in that, you know, we can kind of mess around. We can figure out what's going on here, and don't be afraid to try something new just
mm,
because you haven't met someone that does it that way.
yeah. That does seem like I feel like I mean, you're on the Discord, you're within the guild, and you kind of see like what's going on there. I think it's really interesting to hear lots of new people come in, and we all seem to have the same initial impressions. A lot of people are coming from an engineering background, and they do look at it as like, I just have to do this, and then I'll do it, right? There should
Hmm.
be a way to look at it from a finite perspective, because that's what we're trained to think, that there's like an answer, and that you apply this, you put this much x, function of x gives you y, and it's like, I wish it was that simple, but there's so many different factors. So
Hmm.
it's a good one. um, Thanks for sharing that.
Of course.
um, is there anything that you feel like you're currently learning that separates things out for you, like that you're like, I want to continue, this is like my continuing education?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, there's like a couple things that are sort of top of mind for us in improving within our facility. So,
Hmm.
um, like steam generation is one for us that we're sort of always trying to find ways to steam our rice better. Um, I think that's like a never-ending pursuit until, like, we spend a large amount of capital investment to get a purpose-built steaming sake rice steaming machine.
Sure.
Um, I think that's sort of always going to be like a holy grail to make incremental
Yeah.
improvements in that process, and ways to just make it consistent.
Yeah.
Um, and then um, I think the other thing that we're looking at is, yeah, just like small improvements. Like, how can we reduce our kasubuai and still like keep a quality
Totally.
product? And how
Totally.
can, from like a budgetary standpoint, that's super impactful. Like, we can make great sake, but if we have 60% kasubuai,
Mm.
then we're going to be charging $85 for a glass of sake, and no one's going to buy it. So, at the end of the day, as much as we love it, it's got to be, it's a product, so people have to buy it. So we have to, keep in mind what the market will bear. Um, it can't just be like our little pet project that we
Yeah.
that we drink after hours at the bar. So.
No, 100%. I think the aspect of running the business is definitely one of those big ones. Especially, that's a big learning gap for a lot of people. How do we get to actually running this? Um, well, hopefully this next question is a little bit easier, and then we're gonna kick over to your slides. So, of course, this could be the hardest question I've asked you so far. What is your favorite bottle or style of sake?
Mm. Uh, Style wise, I'm all over the place. It
Yeah.
it never stays the same. So this time of year, I'll kind of go through a ginjo phase. I think, kind of as the end of the summer comes around, something a little lighter, more delicate sounds great. But now we're getting into like Yamahai season. You know, forget pumpkin spice. It's all about that funk. Um, so that's kind of where I'm at right now. But then more broadly, or I guess less broadly, more specifically for individual sakes, I'm a really big fan, generally speaking, of sakes from northern Japan,
Oh,
Tohoku region in
yeah.
particular. It is probably part of my upbringing here in Moto-e that it's also an influence of Blake, our founder and head brewer. But Asahi Shuzo, makers
Hmm.
of Yuki no Bosha, Cabin in the
Hmm.
Snow.
Hmm.
They have an amazing sake, the name of which I can never remember. It's, I think, Kacho Kiseki. Uh, it
Take your word for it.
yeah, it translates to like evening sun, morning moon,
Sure.
flower. It's a beautiful, beautiful Yamada Nishiki 35,
Uh,
super delicate, clean sake.
okay.
And then I'm also a big fan of sakes from Tsukinowa Iwate,
Okay.
just across the mountain range there. Um, just awesome, flavorful sakes that are also just easy to drink tons of.
That's the dream, right? Making sure that there's a sake that's just easy to drink. It's one of those things you can just put a whole bunch down. I sometimes it's nice to have something that's a little bit. We were talking about this. Like sometimes it's nice to have that like one glass of something that's like a little different,
Sure.
stronger in various ways. But yeah, especially if you're running a business, it's nice to have something that's a bottle tastes good and you're not overwhelmed halfway through. Anyway, I appreciate you sharing. It's always interesting hearing. I feel like I got to change that question up. I like that where it is, but I like the way you answered it, sort of like there's various styles. And I think if anything, what's more interesting to hear is like, why does someone like a particular style? Like what attracts them to that thing, as opposed to just simply, this is my favorite. So great. Well,
Yeah.
why don't we kick this off? Because as I said, I wanted to put more of our questions into the actual slides because there's a lot of stuff here you're doing. So again, we're going to be talking about building a sake program. Nick's prepared a phenomenal amount of information, and I think this one's going to be one of those people come back to again and again as they're planning their own. So why don't we go ahead and get those up, and you can take it away. Thank you, Nick.
All right. Yeah, of course. So building a sake quality program. That's the goal for today's presentation. Um, as a forewarning, my aim in this presentation is more for breadth than depth. So there's a lot of stuff that we'll talk about that you're probably like, well, why do you want to do that? Or how do you do that? But the goal is more to cover like what could be done. And then for future discussions in the Discord or in the chat, or maybe in another presentation to talk about like the specific mechanisms by which some of these metrics are actually measured, or what like limits you should be setting for yourself, those kind of things. So there's three sections that I'm hoping to cover today. First, just sort of a context setting of what is quality, what does quality mean? Then in the second part, we're going to talk about building that program. So this will be more of a focus on like what tools, what equipment you can supply yourself um, with some recognition giving to things that you can do for free, things that are relatively cheap, and then if you're a budding um, Desai or Gekikan and you're going to take over the world, what's the upper limit if you have no money or money's no concern, where could you go? And then from the third portion, we'll just kind of follow the flow of sake making broadly and talk about some specific control points that you could consider incorporating into your quality program to make a consistent product. So what is quality? Let's get on the same page here. So quality means different things to different people, especially if outside of the manufacturing world, it can mean something different entirely. So I thought I'd just start by pulling this quote from the book that I have on screen there, Quality Assurance for the Food Industry. This is like a gold standard for food manufacturing quality management. So if you can buy one book to sort of understand quality as a concept, this would be a great one. And so the book starts by saying the concept of quality is often confused with the idea that a product is quality. A product of quality is a luxury item, which in turn implies a costly item. From a practical point of view, however, quality is nothing more than customer satisfaction. At the manufacturing level, quality is defined as an increased level of productivity and safety. It's not possible to talk about quality of a product without considering its safety and vice versa. So sake specifically is a pretty low risk item, but there are some special considerations we should take to make sure that the product is safe. So a lot of what you'll read in the food industry is focused on those types of risks. Loosely, quality is a hierarchical structure. So you'll hear a lot of different terms relating to quality as a concept. A quality program or a system is all of the components together that create the culture of quality within a company. So the prerequisite programs, the tools, the documents, just the people themselves are all part of a broader quality system. And then the concept of quality assurance is broadly the procedures that you establish beforehand to ensure that you will be successful. So your method to prevent defects. And then quality control is a subset within quality assurance where you're actually confirming that quality was achieved, where you're actually doing tests or analyzation to ensure that you've complied with whatever your defined end goal is. So today we're going to talk about some metrics for QA and QC, but I'm mostly just going to use the term quality liberally, probably incorrectly and interchangeably. So just, we're all talking about quality here, folks. So if you want to learn more about quality broadly, there are a handful of very specific quality systems that have been created over the years. These are company-wide programs designed to ensure cultures of quality regardless of what the product is being sold or being made. These systems aren't particularly germane to our discussion today, but if you are a brewery that's growing, or if you plan to distribute nationwide or internationally, or you're just going to have a lot of employees and be very big, you might want to consider incorporating one of these actually structured quality systems that have trainings, definitions, certifications that go along with them. So total quality management was like kind of the first popular one that gained favor in the 80s. It comes from a military background and specifications for getting equipment ready for wartime. That kind of fell out of favor in the 90s and was replaced by the remaining three. Lean manufacturing, you may have also heard of as the Toyota method. It's largely was created as a way to reduce waste and to transform their production into a just-in-time manufacturing system. Six Sigma was created at Motorola, but it was really popularized by Jack Welch and his rise to fame at General Electric. The name kind of harkens to a statistical model of like defining your accuracy and precision to such an extent that even if you are several standard deviations out of the mean, you're still within a tolerance for a successful product. That doesn't really apply. Just a little tidbit there in case you really care what Six Sigma means. And then ISO 900 is, or 9000 is a set of standards that were created by the International Organization for Standardization to create a unified quality system that actually can have certification. If you're a manufacturing facility, you can have an outside auditor come in and say, this facility is ISO 9000 certified. They have the internal structure to make sure that their products are what they say they're going to be. Then within the food industry specifically, there, or maybe more broadly consumables, there are more dedicated quality systems that exist. Some of them more holistic and some of them more less holistic and just more specific to actually controlling risk. So the three that you probably see most often are GMPs, or good manufacturing practices, sometimes called CGMPs for current good manufacturing practices. There are defined rules by the FDA that exist for different products. So pharmaceuticals, human food, animal food, etc. They're just sets of rules for safely making things. HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points, is a food-specific risk assessment system that was originally invented to keep astronauts from having diarrhea in space. This has been around a long time, and a lot of local regulatory authorities require it for food manufacturers. And so regardless of everything we talk about, your local authorities might require you to have a HACCP plan, for example, in making your koji. Not if you're a home brewer, obviously, but if you're a commercial manufacturer. And then HARP-C is sort of the newest one in the game, hazard analysis, risk-based prevention controls. This is similar to HACCP, but it has a broader list of risk categories with a slightly different nomenclature for how you, instead of controlling the risk, you're mitigating the risk and sort of what that means. And this was a requirement that came as a part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. If you haven't heard that term and you're a commercial brewer, I would really highly recommend that you visit the Brewers Association, not the Sake Brewers Association, but the Beer Brewers Association in the United States. They've got a lot of really good guidance on who these regulations apply to and what parts of them apply to you. So there are some exemptions for most breweries. That hazard analysis, risk-based preventative controls. Most breweries are exempt from that. But if you are using, in the beer industry, if you're using your spent grains in specific ways, or you're making enough non-alcoholic food products, they may require you to reincorporate that into your facility. And then brew pubs, for example, and small enough facilities, if you're selling directly to the consumer, if you're not distributing, you are usually exempt from FSMA, but you would still have to follow the food code. So I included on the sheet here, or on the slide here, the actual Code of Federal Regulations where the Food Safety Modernization Act is found. And then also an example of a flow chart from the Brewers Association for you to determine, does this actually apply to me? And if it does, you'll need to incorporate HARP-C and some other stringent requirements to make sure your quality program is meeting the federal rules. So for the rest of this conversation, I'm less concerned with the structure of your larger quality system. I mean, you can implement any of those different formal systems, but really whatever you do to make sure that the product you make is the way you want to make it is your quality system. So what I really think you should consider is that all of these programs are driving towards having fewer defective products, in this case sake. So to do that, you have to start by first defining what success and failure are. So procedures should be created that define what are the steps that you're going to actually follow to make your sake, including the control points that we'll talk about. And this will also include, things like your temp control, your recipes, your build procedures for your sake. But in addition to what you might be thinking, like testing for pH or testing for contamination or that kind of thing. And then specifications. You should define for your raw materials, if my rice comes in and it's got bugs, like what am I going to do? Or what am I looking for when my rice comes in? Is a level of broken rice unacceptable or acceptable? And then you should have similarly defined specs for your in-process product. So if you're halfway through your fermentation, are you on track or are you off track based on how it looks? And then obviously your finished product, you're going to have some definition of what your finished product looks like. So there's a couple of mantras that I like to preach generally with regards to quality. You don't know what you don't measure, or another way of another cousin of it being, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So record keeping is critical, and actually measuring what you want to, what goal you want to reach is important. And then every number needs a limit. So if you decide that you want a specific moisture uptake, you should also decide how far away from that number can I be before I have to make a change to my process. In most cases, fewer defects means you're making a more consistent product, but it is important to note that your procedures and specifications could also easily be written to allow for natural variation in product. So, as an example, in Brandon's presentation, he talked about the yeast ring concept that he uses for the BYX series. That product is designed to be different every time he makes it because there's going to be some variation. He might have a broad idea of the flavor profiles he's looking for, but there is an inherent variation that he's going to find in that product, and that can be okay, but it should be intentional. Next, let's talk about building a program. So this section I've blatantly stole from 2 resources and just readapted for the sake making world. First, from the American Society of Brewing Chemists, they have a wonderful guidance document called A Guideline to Growing Your Quality Laboratory. And it's a copyright document. So I just took a little snippet here so you have an idea of what it looks like, but it goes on much longer than what's on the screen. And they sort of define in the beer brewing industry, for a brewery of X production size, which equipment do you need, which equipment is good, and which equipment is not necessary. And then it goes all the way from under a barrel to over 10,000 barrels, I think. And lots of this is very easily adaptable to the sake world. I would highly recommend considering joining the Association of the American Society for Brewing Chemists. Sorry, it's about $200 a year, but then even if you just join it for 1 year, you get access to tons of webinars, courses, their journal, and a whole handful of standardized methods for things like yeast cell counts, viability, etc. So I'd consider it, at least for a year, getting involved in it. Then the other part where I'm going to be ripping a lot of information from and adapting it from is a presentation by Amy Todd from Zymology Labs, which has recently been bought out by another, or merged with another company whose name escapes me, by something. She gives a great presentation called Lab on the Cheap, which is all about things that you can do to start a quality lab in a beer brewery. So for these next handful of slides, I'm going to be sort of adapting her structure, going over these 5 categories, and talking about the specific equipment that you can incorporate into your sake brewery to start a quality program. So first, document control. I know that at the top of this presentation, I said that I quit my horrible food safety job because I was looking at spreadsheets all day, but I have come to love documentation. It is what I think is the most important tool for a quality program, is just having good documentation systems in place. So the advantage or the added bonus to them being very important is that they're also incredibly cheap. Google Docs can handle almost everything you would need, whether it's a spreadsheet or an interlinked set of documents. The list of documents that Amy recommends are pretty standard industry documents. So things like safety data sheets, SDS. So every chemical that you have in your brewery should have this safety data sheet. 1, so that you know how to appropriately use it, and 2, so if something happens, you can respond appropriately and keep you and your team safe. Then you should also have a chem receiving log where you're keeping track of lot codes, receiving dates, use dates, in particular, so that if there's a recall on, say, your sanitizer or your lactic acid or something along those lines, you know where it was used and if you're implicated in that recall. Then GMPs, there's a lot of discussion on GMPs broadly. One book that I would highly recommend if you want to learn more about good manufacturing practices and also FSMA is the book that I have on screen, Quality Labs for Small Brewers. Again, a lot of it, I mean, it's geared, you can see the picture of the beer on the front, but the save for the specific grain tests and CO2 volumes, most of what's in this book is very applicable to any food or beverage manufacturer. And then SOPs are are critically important. Standard operating procedures. They can be super simple or they can be really detailed. They have to meet the level of your staff and the level of complexity for what you're doing. But what Amy says is, if you want to brew consistent beer, you have to consistently brew it. So probably the simplest way to think of this is that your recipe is one form of an SOP, and you wouldn't make sake without a recipe. So, consider making a master batch record that you use every time you make the same sake. And it'd be even better if the format was the same between your various sakes. You're always recording the same information in the same way. And then, forgiving some natural variability between your products, you're building your sake the same way as well. And then you should, as a good prerequisite program, having a cleaning log or cleaning schedule, maintenance, calibration log for your equipment. Those things are critical to make sure that your facility and your equipment are being kept in good repair and good condition. Consumer feedback, I think, is probably warrants a whole presentation of itself. I'll probably say that like a dozen more times during this presentation. I think that's an area where a lot of people are pretty lax. They're like, people at the bar love my sake, or I got a bad review on Google, better throw out a hot flaming reply. You should have a formal process to figure out when you get feedback from the field. Like, for example, when Shinobu talks about the issue that he had with his Nagori, you should have a process to define, how am I going to react to feedback that we get from consumers, and can we trend feedback that we're getting on our product over time. And then you should have a QA QC manual, which is basically it can be a very short document that says, this is how we're going to maintain quality, and it'll say, we're going to look at these different things, and it'll incorporate these procedures, it'll incorporate these maintenance logs. It's sort of the holistic document that ties all of these components together. Yeah, and I think again, just to circle back on another point that other presenters have made, Jake talked a lot about the importance of record keeping, or he at least mentioned it at a couple different times in the presentation about how much he has relied on going back to his wash and soak logs and seeing over time, did the change that he make work, or did it make things better or worse? Even if the change you make, it ends up being a mistake and makes the product worse, defining what you did and how you did it will help you troubleshoot, and then it's a lesson instead of a failure. So documentation is what gets me up in the morning now. Here are some examples of the types of documents that we are using at Moto E. I apologize that they're small, but I figured you didn't want to look at a bunch of slides of different paperwork. So we use software called Podio for our project management. There's a lot of different project management software, basically all just good-looking skins on top of databases. So things like Airtable, Odoo, I think, is another one, Monday, Trello, all that kind of stuff. So we use this software for things like our daily tasks and our work logs. It generates checklists for us. It compiles on any given day. We have a form that we can fill out for washing, for soaking, for steaming, for our koji making process. Anything where we're recording a number, the form to log that information is there, easily accessible to us, either on a computer or even on our phone, so that we can capture the data right when we observe it. And then this software we use outside of the brewery as well. Our human resources departments, our CRMs, our repairs and maintenance, front of house and back of house procedures for the restaurant all rely on this structure so that we have one unified project management system. We do rely heavily on Google Sheets as well. So while we will record the numbers of the day in Podio for any given batch, we'll compile all of the data for that batch into one Google Sheet so that we can see that sake, every aspect of that sake start to finish. So things like the daily temperatures, our wash and soak numbers, the temp curves for the koji, AB curves, Kaosubuai, all that stuff. If you can think of it, it's in that sheet, or we're trying to figure out a way to get into that sheet. And then we also use Google Sheets for, a lot of your normal business stuff like budgets, sales reports, all that kind of stuff. Anything that's like calculation heavy and lots of numbers that we want to try and make like a dashboard out of, we'll use Sheets for. And then Google Docs for actually like the verbose project management. Mostly we're using them for our SOPs. So you can, the example that I've got up here is for our heat exchanger pasteurization process. So if I'm bringing on someone in the department and I want them to pasteurize the sake the same way I do, I'll show them, I'll train them, but then I want them to have this guidance document so that when I step away to go do something else, when I do my middle management, sit in the office, pretend like I'm working thing, then they can pasteurize the sake the same way that I would if I were down in the brewery. Next, sensory. So from a sensory standpoint, there's not a lot of like physical equipment that you really need. You can do a lot of this stuff for very cheap, save for the fact that you need somewhere to do it. So probably the most expensive thing that you have would be your tap room, where your team will actually do their sensory analysis. But then you can also spend a little bit of money on things like spike kits or flavor ingredients or examples, and some statistical software that can manage actual sensory evaluation tests. So, so I think it's worthwhile to think about it critically. But there's a lot of things that you'll want to consider using sensory for, like brand consistency. Does this sake match the previous sake? Does it match the profile that we are shooting for this label? Doing a quality control point of, are we good to release this sake? Does everyone on the team agree this sake is ready? Identifying off flavors for researching new products, and then also for shelf life tests. If you consider having a bottle library, again, space is going to be your biggest constraint. Every time you package a sake, put a bottle of it somewhere cold where it can stay for a long time, and put a bottle of it somewhere hot where it's going to be abused and age quickly, and then use those as standards when you go back for the next batch, or if you want to just see how long is this sake going to last, or what's this sake going to be like in a year, 2 years, that sake that you put on top of your AV equipment is the one that's going to get there in a couple months. So consider those programs as well. There is some investment that you can make in terms of training. Again, buying keeping space for different generations of product, taking the time out of your day to have your staff taste together so that they can develop a common language, and purchasing common flavors like the actual fruits, hops, flowers, bubblegum, cotton candy, all those things to get that vocabulary of your team in line, as well as the spike kits to train yourself for what does diacetyl really taste like, and at what level, or what does it smell like, and at what level can I perceive it, or who on our team is sensitive to diacetyl and who's weak on diacetyl. Like those are worthwhile things to know. And then if you really want to invest in it, there's software like Draught Labs is one specific one that I'm aware of, or sorry, Draught Lab, that has built-in functions for running specific tests, as well as methods to maintain your results over time. But what we have at MotoE is, again, in Podio, just a pretty basic form. I think this is one area where I would like to develop a more rigorous program for us, especially as we try and push more off-sale sake, to try and develop more packaging consistency and quality. And I think sensory is going to play a big part in that for us. So the things that I would consider are what equipment are you going to use to test? So like actually what vessels are you using? And then are you keeping them the same from test to test? So if you're using Ochoko this week, you should use Ochoko next week. If you're going to use globes all the time. Ideally, you'd be tasting your product where your consumer is going to taste it, so you have the same experience they do. So for us, we can go out into the into the restaurant, and we can sit at the bar and taste the product. Sometimes that's a challenge because there's a lot of distractions, but that's going to be the case for your consumer too. So if you're distributing, it might be a little bit harder, but those are considerations that are worth including. And then I would also consider, just for if you're getting started, consider using as a tasting rubric a pre-established sake tasting sheet. So for example, I've copied from, I took this from the JSS Comprehensive Guide to Sake. It's an example of the tasting evaluation sheet that they use in the new sake competition in Japan. And so there's a handful of guidelines that you can use to evaluate, so that every time you taste your sake, you're looking and answering the same questions. Then start there, and then modify your sensory analysis to match the specific issues that you're running into, or the specific goals that you're trying to reach. From the micro standpoint, there are a handful of things that are worth considering. The most straightforward one, or probably the most applicable one, would be conducting cell counts. So you can see that picture on top. I shrunk it quite a bit, but that's Amy's setup for doing cell counts and viability for yeast. You can accumulate this equipment for about $500. A microscope that's got 100 objective lens, some staining equipment, a hemocytometer, that special slide that will allow you to quantify cells, and then pipettes and miscellaneous sampling tools. If you're going to be isolating, propagating yeast, regenerating yeast for multiple batches, then you're going to want some more equipment to aseptically plate and sample and plate and grow your yeast. I think probably most of us aren't operating at that level. Most of us are probably getting cells from a private bank at a company. And then sort of the next step up, where financial investment becomes a requirement, would be if you're going to be doing any sort of environmental or equipment microbial testing. So the next step would be something like an ATP luminometer. It's a little device that you swab a surface. There's a chemical reaction with ATP, sort of the fuel of all living cells. The more organic matter there is, the brighter this swab will glow under UV light. And so that's converted to a numerical value. And so if you're doing something like CIPing a tank, or your heat exchanger, or your bottling line, you would finish that process by doing an ATP swab to confirm that you've actually sanitized the equipment and there's no organic matter present. Next up from that would be actually like doing plating and identification. If you find living cells somewhere in your brewery, that takes a lot of equipment, time, expertise, or shopping it out to a lab. And then the next step up from that, if you're doing that a lot, or if you are regenerating a lot of cultures, you could be doing PCR, polymerase chain reaction, or qPCR, which is sort of this newish technology where you take a sample, put it in a mystery black box, and then it does its best to tell you what specific species of microorganism you have floating around in your stuff. All of those, ATP is probably the cheapest one. You can probably get the luminometer for around $1,000, but then the swabs themselves are $1 to $2 a piece. And then the rest of the stuff, costs and time, increase from there. Next, for chemical considerations, there's a lot of miscellaneous equipment and foundational procedures that support the chem work. And a lot of it extends to other areas of the brewery as well. So having accurate measurement or being able to take accurate measurements is super important for things like weight, volume, density, temperature. So having scales that can be calibrated, having precise graduated cylinders instead of just measuring cups, using micropipetters if you're going to be doing like dilutions or plating, super helpful to be able to get 2.2 mils as opposed to like in a little push of the thumb as opposed to using a tiny little graduated cylinder. And then if you're using hydrometers, consider that hydrometers do have some natural variation, and that if you drop it or if you buy a new hydrometer, you should be checking to confirm that it's calibrated. So as Amy says in her presentation, that the data is only as good as the instruments we use. So really consider a process to keeping your equipment accurate or verifying that it's accurate. Some things that Amy doesn't talk about, but that I do think are important to consider as well is accurate sensors for temperature, humidity, pressure. I think, my gut says that because of how long sake takes to ferment and the specific refrigeration requirements that we have for sake, that having accurate temperature is more important to us in the main fermentation. And then obviously when you're doing koji making, temperature and humidity are incredibly important. So having equipment that can take accurate results for you is important. And then if you're using a mechanical press, knowing the pressure of your press might be worthwhile, or if you're doing carbonation, that might be worthwhile as well. And then I'd also consider, just as a super cheap piece of equipment, your phone, your camera that you have on your phone, having decent lenses for doing like macro pictures of things like koji growth can be really worthwhile. Or when you're doing sensory evaluation, being able to take a photo of your product just to have a standard method of tracking the color of your sake or the clarity of your sake over time. Like, you can build a half respectable program just with your iPhone. So the other things that I would consider are the equipment and the training that you need to take your samples and to prepare your samples. So you should have a procedure to make sure that you're using sanitary procedures when you pull a sample from your tank. But also consider, are you taking your samples at the same time every day, or if at the same time stamps in the life of your batch. Also consider that if you're pulling a Moromi sample, it's going to continue to ferment out on the bench. So how long is that sample sitting out before you actually run the test? And then, you need all the equipment like coffee filters, funnels, stir bars, a way to degas your sample, all those kind of things that are just kind of cheap miscellaneous stuff. And then the last thing I would consider is, regardless or irrespective of equipment, consider your sampling procedures to ensure that you are getting consistent, replicable samples. The way you're sampling, again, same time, same port of the tank, or same method of pulling that sample out, but that also that they're representative. The surface temperature of your Moromi might not be representative of the core temperature, or koji, for example, would be the same case. The surface temperature of the koji is not the same as the corner of the box or the bottom of the box. So consider whether your samples are telling you what you want them to tell you. Then getting a little more specific with chemical equipment. So pH, acidity, and amino acids are very common and important measurements to take. The simplest way to test pH would be test strips or color changing pH indicators. But it's also really cheap nowadays to get an accurate, reliable pH meter. So consider that investment, especially when you get into acidity and amino acids and you're going to be running titrations. You're going to be needing things like burettes and stir bars and beakers. And it is a lot easier and a lot more consistent to do those titrations with a pH meter than a color changing indicator, especially if you have multiple people that are running those tests. Especially if you have colorblind people like me who can't tell the difference between green and red. I'm lucky that stoplights are in the same orientation all over the country. Otherwise, I'd probably be T-boning people left and right. So I guess long story short, buy a pH meter, and then find space in your budget. I bet you can do it. But then if you have a high level of production and you're going to be running a lot of tests, auto titrators do exist that can, even with a carousel, you can put 10 samples in and you can run acidity and amino acid titrations, 10 samples right in a row. The one that I have pictured there is from Kyoto Electronics Manufacturing. And it's great. If you have the budget for it and the need, it will make your test much more replicable, reliable, and it will be safer for your staff as well. So spend it if you got it. Then on to density and alcohol. Obviously, these are important in your main fermentation, also the moto and your finished product. But every day of our Moromi, once we get to day 5 of the main Moromi, we're taking an alcohol and a density reading every single day. So it's worth making sure that you're doing this right. Density, for sure, you can do hydrometers. It's kind of hard to find sake specific ones, but if you can find a specific gravity scale hydrometer that goes to the 1000th gradations, you can probably get close enough. There are now readily available cheapish densitometers. Anton Par that's all they do is make density equipment. Mr. Anton Par way back in the day just really was concerned with how thick things are. So he dedicated his life to figuring out how dense the liquids are. So there are tiers of equipment that are available from them. And then alcohol is also a pain to measure, but it's got to be done because of the nature of how sake ferments. So you can do I know there's a lot of discussion on the Discord and homebrewing sites about using refractometers and hydrometers together to approximate alcohol readings. I don't know what the TTB's stance on that is. I'm guessing it's probably not approved if you're a commercial brewer. So you got to consider things like distillations that you can do manually. You can do ebuyometers, which I have pictured there, that water pipe looking thing. Don't know what a water pipe is. I just heard on the street that's what they look like. And then spectroscopy. So the other picture there is, again, from Chem. They're seductively named ALM 155 is their near infrared spectrometer that will directly measure alcohol. So doing distillations yourself, having done that for years, sucks. Especially, it takes a long time, and then you'll be distracted by something else, and you'll come back to just a burnt caramel sugar flask, and you'll wonder why you have to replace heating mantles 3 times a year because you're distracted by all the other stuff you're doing and boiling them away. And then there's so much human error because you have to use a hydrometer in the end to measure the density of that sample. So at the very least, if you're a commercial brewer, make the step and look at an ebuyometer. But if you are consistently brewing and taking samples on a daily basis, I think it's worth considering financing the more expensive spectroscopy equipment. We have an Anton Par Alex 500, and we can, with 2 hours of like clock time, but 5 minutes of actual work, I can get alcohol and density for 3 different Moromis. Well, really as many as I want. I can do probably 7 or 8 samples with 5 minutes worth of work and 20 milliliters each of product. So the labor and the product savings and the consistency will pay for itself in time if you are doing tests that often. Then as you kind of go from there, I would say everything that we previously talked about is sort of the standard set. And then now these are the things that are kind of building on that program as you either get not necessarily more expensive, but if you get more detailed or more nuanced, you may incorporate these pieces of equipment into your repertoire or into your stable. Glucose meter. We talked during, I think, Brandon's presentation about using just a blood glucose meter. That's what they use in Japan as well. If you go to what's the name of the company? Shizen Kyogo, Shinyo Gaiken Gokyo. You can find the Japanese equivalent of the blood glucose meter. It turns out diabetes is in Japan too, so you can find the equipment to measure glucose directly. Pyruvate measurement. This is one that I've just recently read about that I don't know much about in terms of how to apply it to your practice, but it's something that I'm going to be researching to see what impact it could have on measuring your fermentation. Nitrate test strips, the picture that I have there of the that color gradation. We talked a bit, I think, with in Byron's presentation about the nitrate in the Kimoto and Yamahai methods and how they are toxic to, in particular, yeast. So being able with Kimoto and a Yamahai, being able to test that your nitrate has reduced to a safe level so that your yeast won't die after you pitch it is worthwhile to consider. And then you might want to include things like hot water bath. It could be as simple as a sous vide, or you could buy like a dedicated several $1,000 hot bath machine from Fisher Scientific. But if you're going to be doing like Amazake tests or forced fermentation tests, having something that can hold a consistent temperature for your product is worthwhile. And then I think an increasing number of people are using moisture meters to measure the moisture of their incoming rice. We don't do that here at MotoE, but both Jake and Brandon mentioned using this specific device from KETT, K-E-T-T, to have a quality control on the actual moisture content of the rice itself in absolute terms. And then from there, you can consider a UV vis spectrometer. So you can find these for a couple $1,000 used. There's lots of used lab equipment websites, especially now that like weed labs are boom and bust. There's tons of used equipment out there that's relatively easy to find. And with a spectrophotometer, then you can do all sorts of assays for amylase activity. You can get specific to alpha amylase versus glucoamylase versus specific proteases. You can quantify diacetyl. You can quantify acetaldehyde. You can get very dialed in with numeric values. And then if you really want to spend a bunch of money and not do color changing assays, you can drop tons of money on things like an HPLC or a GCMS, so hot like chromatography equipment. And then you could actually quantify, you could identify in a sample all the aromatic compounds and their quantity. You're probably not going to be doing that unless you're shipping overseas, but definitely not doing it at home unless you work in a lab and you're bringing samples into work. Think about it. Then on the packaging side, this is where I probably have the least worthwhile information to share because we do so little packaging here, or at least the least amount of experience. But there are some pretty cheap investments or cheap procedures that you can put in place to make sure that you have a consistent product. In particular, date and lot coding. If you distribute, the Bioterrorism Act of 2002 requires lot codes. So you should have a way to know if you pick a bottle up off a shelf, when was this made or what lot did it come from? It doesn't necessarily have to be consumer friendly, although there is value in that too. But if you get feedback from a consumer that, hey, this tastes off, or I found X in my product, you knowing which batch that came from will be incredibly valuable. And if you find yourself in a recall situation, anything you can do to limit the scope of your recall is so financially worthwhile. So considering the cost of an inline printer to put a lot code on your bottles or your cans, it'll pay for itself in one recall. Then, if you're doing bottling and canning, you should consider closure testing equipment. So measuring your can seams or how much torque it takes to open your bottle. These are pretty like nuanced level tests, but in the beer brewing industry, they're very common. ATP luminometers, I mentioned already, but they're very they're worthwhile if you have a bottling line, especially if it's like a semi-automated line or an automated line. There's lots of nooks and crannies for that to get nasty, and that's it's worthwhile to make sure you're not contaminating your product right at the last step. If you're carbonating your product, you could consider some equipment to make sure that your carbonation levels are consistent. Brandon has that device where he's measuring the pressure in his bottles as he does that secondary fermentation. But there are also, there's a company, Nagel and Zom, and just on the street, people call it the Zom. That, Austin Powers looking device over there. This will basically just tell you how much carbonation is in your product. And if you want your sparkling sake to be the same every time a consumer has it, it's worth considering. And then I did also already mention having a bottle library to ensure your packaging quality. And then the only thing that I probably wouldn't recommend that Amy talks about in her presentation for beer brewing is a DO meter, dissolved oxygen. They're super expensive, and we just don't really care about it nearly as much in sake. In fact, I would have to dig for it, but there are some articles out there that suggest that there is actually a floor for dissolved oxygen in sake that you don't want to go below, or you'll have negative sensory implications. So something to consider there as well. Okay, on to Chapter 3, sake-specific control points. Lucas, did you have anything you wanted to interject before we get on to the next level?
No. This is so far. This is fantastic. Some great feedback from people on this so far. So nope, keep it on going.
Okay, great. I can't see the chat, so I'm scared.
You had a couple of great points on this, just in terms of different things. Even the API or the APT, the luminometer. I hadn't considered that before. But it did remind me of when you're doing like yeast, doing a lot of yeast work with a laminar flow hood and stuff like that. You often use like a particle counter. Similar reason to be able to identify, what you're actually in your environment. You should have zero particles, right? When you're doing that kind of work. So it's a great idea. Honestly, I really love the sheer amount of potential tools that you kind of presented here. But I've been taking notes on this just to like get back to you, and I'm like, you know what? He's on a roll. I'm just gonna let him keep cranking on it. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. This is a fantastic list. So let's jump into this, because I know this is a big question for a lot of people. It was actually one of the questions we received before we even do this. Is like, well, all right, but of all this, what specifically should I be worried about? And I will say this did come up as a question as you've been going. Hold on, let me pull it up really quick.
Hit me live.
Yeah, right.
What are the people saying?
It was kind of like, what's JJ? So, but it was basically like, there's a lot here, right? This is super daunting, like tons of stuff. And if you're getting started from scratch, sort of ask yourself, all right, well, what do I really need? Like, how do I start this? And then, of course, you guys have been doing this for a long time. You've been brewing for 7 years, but this has been a thing that's been ongoing for a long time. You've been there to get to that level of a lab and what you build. Obviously,
mentioned,
mentioned,
you don't
you don't
need to
need
have
to
these
have these
things. A
things.
lot
A
of
lot
these
of
are
these are
nice to
nice to
have.
haves.
Um,
Um,
is there
is
a
there a
baseline
baseline
that you'd
that
say
you'd say,
like if
like,
you're
if you're
starting
starting
out,
out,
you
you
really
really
should
should
not do
not do
without
without
these,
these,
and you
and you
should be
should
at the
be at the
very
very
least
least
testing
testing
every
every
X
X
amount of
amount of
days?
days?
Sure.
Even just
Even
for
just for
fermentation, I know
fermentation, I
there's a
know there's
lot
a
of
lot of
other
other
bits of this,
bits
but
of this,
even
but
if we
even if
just
we just
covered
covered
fermentation,
fermentation, and
Yeah, totally. So I would say having reliable temperature measuring is important. Especially just given how long sake takes, having
yeah,
something that can record temperature without you
yeah,
is
yeah,
worthwhile, and relatively cheap nowadays.
yeah,
yeah,
Um, and then density, alcohol. If you're just getting started, do the paper napkin approximation of alcohol using the refractometer. That
yeah,
yeah,
that's enough to get you started. That'll allow you to get an A/B curve, which we'll talk about, but that'll allow you to have a lot more insight onto the progress of your fermentation and whether you should be changing the temperatures or adding water and doing other adjustments. I think in terms of numerical values, I mean, if you can document it for free and you can set yourself up with an easy format to write down numbers,
hmm
mhm,
um, write them down. Uh,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then I would say, to start with, you might be doing a little bit of exploratory guessing what's going to be worthwhile. But things like moisture content, um, from a homebrewer perspective or starting perspective, you're going to use relative moisture uptake. So dry weight of the rice, wet weight of the rice. That's going to tell you enough. Um,
yeah,
and then the so use the documentation to be consistent.
sure,
sure,
I'm sure you already have a camera on your phone, so you can gather a lot of information that can be improved later regarding like color of your sake. If you have get a sheet of paper, a sheet of white paper that's like the same whiteness, put that down on the table and put your glass of sake on top. Take a picture and you can color correct for the whiteness of that paper.
yeah,
yeah,
Or they make color scales. I'm not a photographer, so I don't know all the details of what they're called, but you can get that information without having to buy a UV Biz to figure out, what the actual color is of your sake.
mm,
mm,
Uh, those types of things are things that you can do for free. Um, that if you have the capacity to do them and you can make it easy for yourself, they can pay dividends later.
yeah,
yeah,
Uh, but in
yeah,
terms of investments in equipment, temp, um, measurement, so volumes,
yeah.
yeah,
weights, and density and alcohol, those are the ones that you really got to nail down from the start.
I
I think
Everything
that's
else
great.
is built off those.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think
I
one of
think
the
one of the
things that
things that
early
early
on
on
when
when
Justin
Justin
Levon
Levon
was
was
starting out
starting
the
out the
void,
void,
we had
we had
talked a
talked
lot
a lot
about how
about
he
how
was
he was
measuring
measuring
things, and at
things.
the
And at
end of
the
the
end of the
day,
day,
like
like
just
just
having
having
that
that
notebook,
notebook,
like
like
even a
even a
central
central
notebook where
notebook
he
where he
was
was
every
every
single
single
brew
brew,
every
every
single
single
day,
day,
he'd
he'd
go in
go
there
in
and
there
just
and
be
just be
jotting
jotting
down
down
observations.
observations.
Obviously the
Obviously the
data
data
aligned with
aligned
it,
with
but
it, but
the
the
sheer
sheer
fact of,
fact
as
of,
you
as you
said,
said,
just
just
recording
recording
things,
things,
recording your
recording your
sensory,
sensory,
recording
recording
everything
everything
is,
is,
you can
you
do
can do
that
that
cheap,
cheap,
right?
right?
Just
Just
Yeah.
looking
looking
is
is
very
very
cheap.
cheap.
So
So
some might
some
say
might say
free.
free.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
but
but
anyway, I
anyway,
think
I
that's
think that's
great.
great.
It's it's a
It's a
good
good
midway
midway
through
through
this
this
break for
break
you
for
on
you
the
on the
on
on
pounding through
pounding through
the
the
presentation.
presentation. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
think
I
that
think
was a
that was
good
a good
point.
point.
Just like
Just like
the
the
minimal
minimal
kind of
kind of
things
things
people
people
really
really
need.
need.
So
So
Sure.
anyway,
anyway,
we'll jump
we'll
back
jump
into
back into
this,
this,
and
and
I'll
I'll
let you
let
know
you
if
know if
anything else
anything else
comes up.
comes up.
But
But
I
I
think
think
that's a
that's
good
a
one.
good one.
Yeah. Let's do it. Yeah. Feel free to jump in if you're like, you should totally measure this too.
Totally. All right.
All right. So let's go through the flow of how we make sake. Everybody makes it the exact same way, so this should apply to everyone equally. Um, uh, that was a joke. I hope you were Bon Reviewing out there. Um, but before we actually start into the production process itself, let's talk about some prerequisites. And I think this will touch on some of the things we were just talking about. So um, when I was in Niigata for the Brewers Association's Advanced Sake Brewing Certification Program, we visited Ishimoto Shuzo, which are the makers of Koshino Kambai. And they instilled something into us that was kind of a through point for the rest of the program, but they really drilled it into our heads that what you do and what you measure should be defined by your end product. So your process should start by defining what is success. What is the thing that we are trying to make? And then work backwards from that to figure out, okay, what do I need to do between now and then? And then once you define what you need to do to get there, then you can figure out what do I have to measure to make sure that I did that thing. So at first that's going to be difficult, like we were just talking about, that you're probably going to have to start with a very broad path. But then each time that you repeat the cycle, you can tighten your scope a little bit better, and you can say, okay, well, this number wasn't really all that impactful for me, or I've done 5 batches now, and it turns out that counting the chimpaku rate of the rice didn't really have a long impact on my finished product. So you'll start to figure out pretty quickly what is impactful or not. And you'll also figure out what are the faults that I'm dealing with or the issues that I'm running into, and that will inform what metrics you need to measure to improve those issues specifically. So within that, again, I mentioned this at the top, that every number that you have ideally should have a limit. So if you're talking about moisture uptake and your target's 30%, you should say, okay, 30 is what I really want, but if it's 28 to 34, I'm good to go. Or for koji, I'll go a little bit under, but I can't go over, that kind of thing. And then when you get to that process, you'll know already what you're going to do if things are wrong. They could also be a binary measurement. So for example, nitrite, like I talked about in Kimoto and Yamahai, is your goal is non-detectable, 0 ppm. So that's a go, no go test. If you get 10 ppm on your nitrite, then you're going to wait another day and test again before you pitch your yeast, for example. But then it could also be a qualitative release. So your koji organoleptics should be good or not good. Is it acceptable? You might have defined profiles of how your koji should taste or smell, but ultimately you're going to sign off and say yes or no, and that's really the organoleptic component of it really is going to be difficult to put a number on. So then within that, you should also define, you should, as I mentioned, anticipate that things are going to go wrong. So you should plan for things like deviations. If your process is not followed, or if your specification is not met, whether this is intentional or not, that's considered a deviation. So like I mentioned, let's say your koji kin spores are maybe 2 months older than your spec. You might say, okay, 2 months old, probably not going to make the biggest difference. We'll still use it. That's okay. But then you would say, note somewhere in your log, koji was older than we expected. Here's our deviation log for this batch. And then you'd sign off on it. Then you should also consider the alternative where, like, oh man, this koji actually, this batch of koji that we made went to spore or has way too much moisture or organoleptics were bad. Excuse me. Then you would have a CAPA procedure, corrective action, preventative action. And this is where you would actually investigate what was the problem that happened, what caused this problem, and then what can we put in place to prevent this problem from reoccurring. Can we fix what we have? Maybe this koji is usable, but probably not. And then more importantly, you can figure out how do we prevent this problem from recurring in the future. So Shinobu in his presentation talked a lot about, or mentioned, the ticketing system that he used for all the issues in that wonderful section about mistakes were made. I love that. I've never nodded my head in agreement so much in one presentation of hearing every horror story like someone was telling my life back to me. Having a system in place to deal with those issues when they come up is critical. Otherwise, you're just going to be muddling about reacting instead of being proactive. And then lastly, excuse me, change control. So this kind of going back to the point we talked about at the break was you're going to figure out pretty quickly that the plan you started with, plan A, is not the best plan, that it's going to need iteration and revision. And so defining in advance what's your process going to be for making a change to your process is both meta and worthwhile. So, Jake talked a bit about in his presentation about how important record keeping is, so that when you do make a change, you can see, over the years, you're going to be making 5, 6, 7 changes, hopefully not at the same time, but it might your circumstances might necessitate that from batch to batch, you make 2, 3, 4 improvements. Having the logs in place to define what changes you made and what the impact was are going to be critical for you historically to look back and say, did this have the intended effect? And hopefully you have a closed loop so that you can change by change tighten that quality spec and figure out what metrics you need to incorporate or what metrics are actually not all that important. I'm going to go to this next slide, and it's telling me, oh, okay, let me see here. Just getting some weird things on my end saying the slides aren't going to load, so let's see what happens. Okay, so doing this live, folks. Is everything look okay on your end, Lucas? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the raw materials portion of sake making. So there are some prerequisite programs that are worth considering that are, again, relatively cheap. So recording lot codes of products, inspecting the products, having procedures for how to receive and how to store your product. Just basic stuff like the rice has got to be kept in a cool, dark, dry place. And we're going to open the bag when we receive it to make sure it's not contaminated. And then before we put it with the rest of our product, we're not going to spread that contamination. As far as rice is concerned, you might want to consider things like broke or crack counts on the rice, the shimpaku rate, the hardness of the rice, moisture content, using that moisture analyzer that we talked about, even the nutritional analysis. But truth be told, a lot of these I think are pretty high-level concepts that for most brewers, and certainly at the smaller level, aren't really going to be all that impactful. And ideally, we'll get to a place where a lot of this information will be provided by the supplier. It's a lot of onus, I think, to put the sake manufacturer, in this position to do all these tests. That's keyboard for a different computer. I'm in a sea of keyboards here in the office. So for water, again, prerequisites would include things like, is your water potable? That's probably a good starting place. And do you have enough of it to make sake? You are probably well aware that sake is very wet, and then also you have to clean stuff. So making sure that you have enough water and that it can flow sufficiently fast is going to be a necessity. Then you should have some idea of what your water quality is. So if you're getting a municipal water, you should be able to get a water report so that you have an idea of what your starting place is. If you're using well water, then that onus is going to be on you in getting that tested. And then as you grow, if you have a lot of use points for water in your facility, you may want to consider, as part of an environmental testing program, doing water testing microbially at your drop points or your usage points. So if you have like 3 or 4 different process waters or faucets for processed water, you will want to test those eventually at a certain scale. You want to test them to make sure that they're not contributing to contamination of your product. And then also consider, this isn't the case for us, but that I'm aware of, but maybe in some more arid parts of the country, does your municipal water supply or your private well, does the quality of that water change with the seasons? If that does, you should consider how you're going to one, know that it's changing, and then two, how are you going to control for that? So what I would suggest is defining what your water quality, or sorry, your water standard is. It can, for us, it's pretty broad. It's just whatever the city gives to us. There's not a lot of variation that we get in Minneapolis, but you may have to work a little bit harder on that if you are getting really hard water that you have to do reverse osmosis on, um, and then add minerals back in. You're going to have to do a lot more work to consider what needs to be done to that water. So a program for your water softener, for maintenance and a schedule there. For your reverse osmosis, you might measure things like conductivity of the water, or total dissolved solids, to make sure that you're actually getting RO water. And then, of course, what minerals and what quantity you're adding back into the water should be defined as well. For us, we are just using filtered city tap water. So the only real metrics that we're using are how often we're changing our filters, and our UV sterilization lamp. And you can't really, you probably can't see it well in this photo, but we keep a flow meter on our processed water, our brew water, so that we can track our total usage of water, and then we change out our filters at a set frequency. And again, this could be its own presentation. There is a like widely considered Bible for water quality in brewing generally. It's called Water: A Comprehensive Guide for Brewers, by Palmer and Kaminsky. You can find it readily from Amazon. People know how to find books. You don't need me to tell you where to find it. But if you have to do a lot with your water, start with that book and then figure out where to go from there. So for Koji, there's not, beyond the receiving and storage programs, for the actual ingredient, the spores themselves, there's not really a lot that you can do. You need to make sure that you're keeping them somewhere dry so that they aren't damaged. You should keep track of the lots and how old they are and those types of things. But unless you're propagating your own spores, the raw material itself doesn't, in my opinion, require much work. If you are propagating them yourselves, I suggest you stop, because you probably won't do it as the hundred-year-old spore manufacturers. But you do you. If you're doing that, I have no advice for you. You're already a cowboy, so just keep riding. Then yeast is kind of the same, at least to start. If you're in a situation like us, you're buying smack. Well, if you're a home brewer, you're probably buying smack packs, or if you're a small scale brewer, you probably have a private bank like Omega or White Labs that houses your cultures, and then builds up a prop for you. It's certainly possible to get by with relying on the prop counts from the supplier, and then developing your process around using those numbers in terms of cell count and viability. You can rely on the cell counts from your supplier, as long as you're tracking things like lot codes and condition of the yeast, age of the yeast, between when you receive it, when you use it, things like that. But then it's not that far of a stretch to just pull a sample of your yeast culture and do a viability count. If you're using dry yeast, then you have a lot less to worry about. For cell count methods, that manual via the hemocytometer, it has tons of resources. You can find them literally everywhere online, but Escarpment Labs is a great resource for that actual procedure. But there are some software applications out there now that can take some of the pain out of enumeration. Some automated devices that can use other metrics like turbidity, and I think conductivity is another one. But they're all with more cost and less reliability. So unless you're doing like a very high volume, large throughput, cell counts that are just manually done is probably the simplest. But then with that, you should determine, once you're doing cell counts, you should have a definition for what is your pitch rate. So how many cells are you actually going to pitch into your moto? And then you should also consider a viability limit as well. What are you going to do if you do your cell count and only half of your cells are alive? You might still be able to grow up a large enough culture of yeast, but then you're going to have to deal with the potential off flavors from weak yeast and dead cells that are going into your moto. So those are worthwhile quality metrics to consider for the yeast itself. And then you could consider things like strain identification and confirmation, especially if you're going to be propagating your own yeast. You might want to spend more time, but it's probably, the cost benefit is probably not in your favor unless you're intending to do like really wild ferments, or if you're doing a lot of like ambient yeast kind of things. I think that is probably not germane for most people. Then once you have all your raw ingredients, the first step is to wash and soak. Some quality metrics to consider is your water quality, as we already talked about. So one thing I didn't mention on the water standard that you have hopefully written for yourself is that you should have a different water standard for the different uses of your water, mainly meaning the water that's going into your product should have one standard, and the water you're using for cleaning can have a much lower standard. You don't have to necessarily remove heavy metals or iron and manganese from your wash down water, but you do want to make sure your wash and rinse water your wash and soak water has had any metals removed. And then consider recording your rice temperature and your water temperature. Define how long you're going to wash your rice, recording the lot codes of your rice. That's been a big thing for us. We're able to get pretty consistent with our wash soak times to hit we run by moisture uptake. So we're able to get pretty dialed in with our numbers, even given temperature variation in the rice, so long as we're in the same lot code of rice. If I know that this came from the same mill run of rice, I know that its moisture uptake is going to be consistent. But as soon as I switch to the next mill run, then I have to accept that there might be that it might take a different amount of time for that rice to absorb the same amount of moisture. So I might switch then to a smaller test bag of rice. And then on the subject of moisture, you should define, are you going to be using absolute moisture, or are you going to be using the uptake percentage? Uptake is probably a good starting point. That's what we've done for 16 years. So that works well for us. But then you could also consider using that visual inspection of pulling a sample with the black plate. I've got a photo of it, I think, later on if you're not familiar. But I think that's going to be a hard standard to define. And on the topic of defining standards, what's your process for washing your rice? How long are you going to be running it through that machine? Or if you're washing by hand, how are you going to decide when it's completely washed? Are you going to go by time? Are you going to go by the cloudiness of the water? How are you going to ensure that when you wash by hand, that this bag and the next bag are consistent? And then also consider, are you doing like a post-wash rinse before you go into the water? Are you going to have one big giant container of water, or are you going to have multiple individual containers of water for each little incremental amount of rice that you wash? And then when you are calculating the moisture uptake of your rice, one, are you going to calculate it? That when I was in Gakogura, they had done test batches of this specific rice, and they set all of their wash water to exactly 20 degrees C. And so then they relied simply on time. All of their bags were soaked for the exact amount of time, but then we didn't confirm afterwards that they had reached the appropriate level of moisture uptake. The first bag, maybe there was a visual check just to confirm that we're in the same ballpark, but then after that, time was enough for them to get to an acceptable level. And then you should consider, so to that point, how are you gonna confirm your numbers? Are you gonna do it in bulk are you gonna weigh all your rice at once? Are you gonna weigh each individual bag? Are you gonna not weigh at all? And then I've mentioned before, defining those limits of what's an acceptable moisture content for your finished soaked rice. And then if you are gonna measure the weight of your rice, how are you going to actually measure that weight? You can see in the picture, we've got one of those funnel and vacuum setups that we've jerry-rigged together. So after we pull our bag of rice out of the water, it's going into that funnel for exactly 4 minutes of vacuuming. And then every single bag has had the exact same amount of water removed from the bag when we measure it. So even if that number isn't necessarily accurate to what the final rice will be, I know that when I compare this batch to the last batch, I'm measuring it in the same way so that those numbers are true relative to each other, which in most cases is good enough. If you can define your internal process to be consistent, that will get you 95% of the way. Then you can measure the changes that you've made over time. And then similarly, after you've weighed your rice, after you've washed it, soaked it, weighed it, what are you going to do with it between now and when you steam it? How long are you going to wait? How are you going to store it? How are you going to protect it from contamination? Are you going to cover it, keep it? Are you going to put it in the cooler? Are you going to leave it at ambient temperature? Are you going to cover it? Are you going to let air flow over it? Are you going to make sure all the vents are turned off? Those are things that you should consider. So some other things that that Shinobu talked about, like having he had a super defined process for his draining and his vacuum time, and then he also talked about the pressure of his water causing issues. So is that something that you need to vary? We have a setup where we're using a buffer tank of water and then we're pumping the water through the washer, so our pressure is very consistent. But if you're using just your water from your municipality, that pressure to run your machine, you should probably have a way to record what that pressure is to make sure that you're washing the rice consistently from batch to batch. And then Jake obviously had a whole presentation about washing and soaking, so a lot of what I'm saying is probably redundant and unnecessary. This is an example here. I probably could have switched slides sooner to keep this a little more interesting, but this is an example of how we're measuring our moisture uptake. This old school on the whiteboard spreadsheet where we're measuring dry weight, the time on the stopwatch that it goes in, the amount of time it's in the water, time it goes out, the wet weight, and then we're calculating our percentage that we've uptake. We'll also record our water. We'll record the pressure on the machine or confirm that it's set to the right pressure. And we'll then calculate our average total moisture uptake for the batch. But I also tend to measure or calculate the standard deviation across all of our bags. So I can say, was this run of 200 kilos of rice, how tightly knit were my wash soak results? Or was I like all over the place? If I'm all over the place, even if my average for the whole batch is great, I might have a hard time making koji with that rice, because the one part of the rice will be much drier than another part of the rice. So, and then this slide is that, I don't know what the name of this test is, but it's that black plate where you pick up some of the rice to see the moisture intrusion into the grain. And that was enough at Gakogura for their brewing team to confirm that their numbers were good enough, were on track. Next, for steaming, Jake again talked quite a bit about this, so I'll try to go a little bit faster. But obviously the goal here is to gelatinize our starch molecules, but there's some secondary effects like aiding in the dissolution of the rice. Or sorry, the gelatinization is to aid in the dissolution of the rice and to get access to the enzymes, for the enzymes to the starch molecule. But there's secondary goals of sterilizing the rice, driving off some unfavorable nutrients like fats. So you do need to define more broadly than just your mochi standard, like how long are you going to run your steam, and other conditions related to it. So the big prerequisite is making sure that you have enough steam. There are some complicated calculations you can do to figure out for your amount of rice and the conditions of your room, how much steam in terms of kilograms per hour do you need to supply to adequately steam your rice. And I can find a way to get that information to people. But then in terms of the finished product, some quality metrics that you should consider are that Hineri Mochi test. We talked about this, or Jake talked about this in his presentation, but I did want to highlight with this image. If you go to Nakaji Koji fermentation on YouTube, he's the author of the Koji is Life or Koji Life book. He's got a great little video of him actually doing the Hineri Mochi and showing you like what the consistency is that you'd be looking for. So if you're unfamiliar with that test, that's a good resource to see it in practice. And then there are other methods that you could use to determine gelatinization, like using potassium hydroxide, differential scanning, iodine staining, but they're all just way more involved than I think anyone at this scale would ever need. And then another metric that you can use is the weight. Jake talked about how much moisture is being absorbed by the rice will translate to an increase in the weight of the rice from before going into the steamer to coming out. For my perspective is that that's worthwhile if you're making a process change or if you're initially setting up your steamer. But once you have a defined process, I don't go through the trouble of weighing my rice every time I take it out of the steamer, in part because it's a pain in the neck to figure out how to weigh 200 kilos of rice when you're scooping it out hand by hand, bucket by bucket. Part of that's our limitations. If you are like Justin, for example, at the Void, I think has big, large bags that he'll lift with a hoist, and he's got a hoist scale, and so he can weigh that whole bag all at once. If you can do it, go for it. That's great. But if you're scooping it out with a shovel or a pail, it might not be worth your time unless you notice something has gone wrong or you're trying to make a change. And then I would also consider the conditions of the steamer. So as I mentioned already, how long are you steaming? What's the temperature inside the steamer, both at the steam front and then even potentially at the top of your steamer where the steam is escaping past the rice? There was a bit of discussion, I think, in Jake's presentation about, the burnt crispy rice that you might get. That can happen when you are using superheated dry steam. So just as a point of reference, a lot of breweries will use just regular saturated steam, like the kind you would get from boiling water, for the majority of their steam. And then the last 10 minutes really is only that superheated dry steam to try and dry the exterior of the grains. If you use that just dry steam the entire time, you can really run the risk of burning your rice. So having a plan for how you're going to apply the different types of steam for how long is worth considering. And then also, are you going to follow the same procedure from rice to rice, that kind of thing. And then you should also consider how are you actually going to build your steamer, in the sense of, are you going to use cloths? Are you going to use gijimai, that pseudo dummy rice? If you are steaming more than one type of rice, are you putting the koji rice on top of your kakamai? Hopefully the answer is yes. And then how much space are you putting between your steam source and the rice itself? Those are all things to consider. And then as you start your your steamer, there's a process known as nukake or nukegake, where you are sort of building your rice in layers as the steam front goes up through it. Some people follow that procedure and some don't, but you should decide whether or not you're going to, and be consistent from batch to batch.
In here 1 sec. So the steam saturation is actually, I know you've been looking into this, and I've actually called around to a number of the suppliers within the U.S. I know obviously different countries, different continents that are watching this are going to probably have different local supplies, but this is actually a big challenge to find someone who does, like, say, electric steam. Maybe boiler is a little bit different, but um, there are components you can get to obviously superheat that steam coming out of it, and it doesn't seem like it's as available in the standard setup for people. So it is something that, especially like having worked with myself in Japan, and seeing the ease at which someone just kind of goes over to a wall and cranks up one knob or cranks down another one, and I thought, boy, that would be nice.
Mhm.
So that's definitely something I think as an industry we do need to really pay a little bit more attention to, not because it's necessary, but because you can control the quality of the final rice, especially if you're doing koji. It has its benefits. So
Totally.
um, yeah, thought I'd make a mention of it. It's one of those things that, like, for anyone out there who's like thinking about it, going, "Ooh, yeah, I'd love to do that." Um, if we do find something, we'll put it up on the website so that people can call that company or whoever will be a good resource. But I think if you're on a small scale and you're doing something like a 48 kilowatt um, system or something like that, you're probably not you're probably not looking at a super heater. It's just it's a that's usually more for a larger capacity. But yeah, you haven't found anything like that, have you yet? Like anyone that's specifically providing that?
Um, no, I mean, I think there are people that will make, not on a small scale. I
Yeah,
should correct myself.
yeah.
You can do. I've seen some redneck engineering of kegs turned into boilers, and then as the steam goes through the supply tube, a coil will go over a
Yeah,
flame burner or something like that.
uh,
Um, please don't try and do that. Uh,
yeah.
it's
The
not
the
worth
cake
it.
bob is it's
Yeah,
I've seen it too, and I'm like, ooh,
yeah. Um,
wear
but
protective gear.
there are, I mean, so to give you some context for what we do, we have like a more traditional, um, I say traditional, but like sort of the more old school method of the wagama, the like boiling tank of water with the kettle then on top of it. And so what we have on the bottom is a steam kettle that you would see in like a commercial commissary kitchen. And it's got an electric heating element that heats the water through the sides of the pot, and that boils the water, and the steam goes up through the rice. Um, what we've started doing in previous years, we didn't pay attention to how much water we put into the tank. We just filled it up to the top, turned it on. When it was boiling, we'd go. But what I've started doing in the last year, having learned more about steam quality and superheating steam, is that we're starting with a lower level of water, so that as the water boils during the steam, it's getting the level is getting low enough so that towards the end, more of the sides of the tank of the pot are exposed. So the heat from the tank itself is then, obviously the water's still boiling, but as the steam comes up, it's getting convection heat from the radiant heat from the sides of the pot. And so then that's heating the steam up past 100 C. Um, it's not perfect by any means, because it requires a lot of control. The biggest challenge for us is getting a good seal between our pot and the boiling vessel.
Right,
If you have any steam escaping, your pressure drops, and then all your temperatures drop.
right.
But um,
You're pretty much operating at like one atmosphere. Like you're hitting 100, but you're not doing it at like 12 psi or anything like that. It's
uh,
not.
it's we can get just above atmosphere,
Okay.
but not a lot. So we can get
Yeah.
to like 101, 101 C if we dial things in and everything's
Yeah.
running perfectly. But let me
And at the end
Let me
of the
see.
day, just a quick note on this.
I'm trying to. My screen is not looking great, so I don't know what you can see. But I have a video of our steamer.
Oh yeah, that played, by the way.
Oh, it
That
did.
definitely,
Okay, yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
like wasn't
Um,
showing a preview. So
I think it's important to note that like Tsukino Katsura and like other older breweries that are still very successful at selling sake are operating in the exact same way Moto E is operating, like a large kettle that boils, and that is it. There's no other. So like these are other advancements that have gone on in years, and people saying, hey, we can do this and get a specific type of texture. They are not necessary, and there's no quality differentiation per se. It's all just a matter of, you know, trying to fine tune things. But yeah.
and I mean a lot of this concept behind the superheating of steam in the final minutes is built around replicating that very concept that I was talking about and trying to take what was happening in these old cast iron kettles and recreate it using modern equipment.
Right.
So, you know, if it worked 700 years ago, maybe it works today. I don't know. Okay, so then to kind of on the point of pressure, um, let's see if I can get this to play. Yeah, okay, so that little clip, I can play it again, I think, is just the cover on our kettle is on our koshiki. I'm tapping it there. There's enough pressure off that steam front to have it inflated like, the skin of a drum. I know you guys talked about that a bit with Jake's presentation. So that for us is our visual indication that like the steamer is operating appropriately, that we have enough pressure inside the vessel to make sure even the rice at the very top has heat held onto it, and that our rice will get sufficiently cooked. Okay. So last couple thoughts here on steaming. I said it was going to be quick. I always get stuck on steaming. No more mushy mai. That's what I like to say. That's a pun. If you want to look it up after, you can. Ask your parents. So for standards to define, I already talked about steam duration, but are you going to vary it by the type of rice you're using, the mill rate of the rice, whether the rice is going to koji or kakamai? When are you going to start the timer on your steam? Is it going to be when the steam reaches the last amount of rice at the top of the tank, or is it going to be when you strap the lid on and then it inflates to a tight drum top? Whichever you choose, you should just make sure that that's what you're using. And then similarly, all the steps of like putting the rice in, what material to use, how you're loading it, those should be considered and defined as well, so that each time you do it, it's the same. Okay, then on to koji. I mean, a lot of koji material was covered with chiaki, so I don't want to retread things too much, but I'll just kind of run through the list of things that you could consider in your quality program. So prerequisites, number one is sanitation. If there's a room in your brewery that gets the most sanitation, it should be this one. So if you're going to consider things like ATP or environmental air or surface testing, this is the room to do it in. And then, but at a more basic level, you can just define what's the equipment that we're going to use in this room, how are we going to use it, how are we going to clean it, and then, like what shoes are we going to wear, what clothes are we going to wear, are we going to use gloves or not use gloves? Those are all things that should be considered and defined as well before you even get into the actual making of the koji. And then for metrics to consider, obviously moisture of the rice is super important. So whether you're measuring it directly or you're keeping track of your wash and soak numbers, you should have a way to link for this rice that I washed and soaked. This was the batch of koji I made from it. And then you'll start to see correlations between a higher wash, soak, and temperature curves in your koji room, or the level of haze on your rice, you'll start to see those correlations over time. You should consider the amount of rice that you're putting into your room. So especially if you're on a very small scale, the rice itself is going to change the conditions of the room. So if you have a very small, walk-in closet or like a shower like setup, kind of like Shinobu's first little nook that he was making koji in, maxing that out with rice is going to dramatically change the conditions in the room. So consider the extremes of your rice volume. Consider the quality of your spores. So what lot number are they? How old is it? How long have you had it? But then also consider like the mass of spores that you're applying. So in particular for the granular type koji, how are you going to shake that rice on? You might have a method for calculating how much weight of tane koji to use for that weight of rice, but then how much are you going to shake the canister to get the grains out? And then that's going to be something that is like hard to numerically define. But if you have multiple people that are applying spores, you want to make sure that they're consistent in how they're applying that amount of spores. So one thing that Blake and I have actually been tripped up on this, where like the deftness of our hands is different enough that if we're not on the same page about how heavily to spore the rice, I could spore it one way and he could go in and handle the rice thinking that it's going to react to his level of sporing. So we've started to do some analysis on weighing that shaker. We use the granular type, and we've got sort of those, cappuccino duster shakers, and we'll weigh out our spores at the start, and then after we apply it, we'll weigh it again and see what was the actual change in weight in terms of spores. We haven't collected enough data for that to be significant yet, but the goal is for he and I to be consistent with how much we're actually applying. And then there's some other considerations for the finished product that you should think about. Enzyme activity would be the biggest one. I know there's a lot of discussion on Brew Sake in the Discord about the Amazake tests. So taking a sample, liquefying it, holding it at a temperature, and then measuring the change in Brix or glucose or density. There are also colorimetric assays that you can do. As I talked about in the chem section with a UV vis, you can pretty easily numerically define the level of enzymatic activity with increasing amounts of specificity. You might want to consider the weight change of the koji. A lot of people have scales built into their koji tables, or they'll weigh the finished product to compare the weight of the finished koji to the dry starting weight of the rice. Organoleptics obviously are critical in this stage to make sure that you don't have any contamination. But again, busting out that iPhone, you can visually demonstrate how much hyphae growth you have. Did you spore by checking color? Is there coverage on the outside of the grain? How deep is the penetration, or how spotty is the penetration? And also just generally the color of the finished product. And then more simply, taste and smell. Does it taste good? Does it smell like you expect it to? Those are all like worthwhile go, no go tests at the end of your koji. As you get bigger, you could certainly consider doing microplating, PCR to check for spoilage organisms. Again, especially if you're like making your own spores, or if you're using multiple different species, that might be worthwhile to consider. And then, there's tons of attributes that you can get from the supplier that probably aren't worth measuring yourself, but you could, like glucoamylase, alpha amylase, G to A ratio. You could certainly do those if you really wanted to quantify them. And then just some other things that I've that are kind of in the back of my mind, but I haven't actually measured specifically are what are the exterior conditions to your room? So outside of your koji chamber, what is the temperature and the humidity when you're making it? That's going to impact how your koji grows and how your chamber changes as you go in and out of it. And then also, what are the CO2 and the oxygen concentrations in the room? Are you getting enough air turnover to facilitate the growth of the koji mold? I don't know what those numbers and limits are, or if there's a good amount of research in them, but it's something that's kind of been in the back of my mind to think about in the future. From a standards perspective, tons of procedures here. I don't know that it really needs to, I need to go much into this, but times, temps, when you mix, how often you're mixing. Chiaki covered a lot of that material, so I would say the good starting point would be to go back to her, and then I mean, you'll never stop asking these questions. Then just as an example of some of the metrics that we use, this is our for our temperature and sensor management, we use a company called Craft Metrics out of Canada. And so we can get real-time temperature, humidity. We'll measure both dry bulb and wet bulb. And then obviously we'll do the temperature of the koji itself. So I just picked some random batch here that we made back in April of this year. And you can see that we're able to plot all those temperatures and room conditions. Then in the moto, again, a lot of discussion here from Byron's presentation, but also Shinobu talked about like environmental considerations for like where their motos were and how changing from one brewery to the next changed the success of their Kimoto. Brandon talked a lot about the variability of the BYX series and switching from dry yeast or the Kobo Jikomi to using a moto. So there's a lot of valuable information in the other presentations in that regard. But some metrics that you should consider in your quality program are things like acidity and pH. Is your acid generation sufficient to protect your yeast? I think general consensus is to get it down below 4. It should be like a stable pH from a food safety perspective. You should pay attention to the nitrites in your moto, especially if you are doing Yamaha or Kimoto. The alcohol concentration in your moto is worth considering. At the very least, as you try new methods or as you make changes. The numbers that I've heard are to absolutely keep it under 15%, but at 12 is when your yeast is going to stop multiplying, somewhere around there. So those are benchmarks to stay under. Byron mentioned that he doesn't go above 10%. So especially if you have a long moto like a Yamaha or Kimoto, it's worth taking some of those tests along the way. Cell counts are worthwhile as you pitch. If you are willing to go through the struggle of trying to get a cell count from the slurry of a finished moto, God bless you. But my experience, it's been a pain with all the other organic material floating around in the sample to get a well replicable test result. And then obviously, you're going to have a temp curve for your moto that's worth monitoring. And then measurements of your either glucose or your density to ensure that you're creating the sugar and then the yeast are metabolizing the sugar to grow. And then in terms of process, you should also consider how and when you're going to mix your starter, and how will you actually build your starter. I know there's a variety of ways of We're going to add the water, then the rice, then the koji. We're going to put the lactic acid in right at the beginning, or we're going to add lactic acid and yeast together. How are you going to manage if you're doing koentoka, for example, you're starting at a high temperature and then ramping down. What time frame are you going to do that in? Those are all types of considerations to build into your process and recipe. From the Moromi, there are a handful of metrics that I would suggest you consider. Number one would be the AB curve. I don't know that this has come up in a presentation yet, but just so that it's clear what an AB curve is, when you take your samples, measuring the alcohol and the density in the form of bome, you'll simply plot on the vertical axis your bome, on the horizontal axis your alcohol, and then you should, at the start of your batch, know what your target final alcohol and bome are. And then when you reach your peak bome, draw a straight line from that point to your finished product. And that will give you an idea of how your multiple parallel fermentations are competing with each other. So if you are below that line, either your saccharification is too slow or your yeast are progressing too fast. So in either case, you want to slow your yeast down so that the speeds are in line. So that would involve dropping the temperature. If you're on the other side of the line, that means that you're making sugar faster than your yeast are consuming it. So you can consider raising your temperature, or particularly later in the batch, adding water to relieve some stress on the yeast so that they can continue to ferment. I kind of already mentioned that at 12 ABV, the yeast are going to stop multiplying. So from our perspective, we try and get as close to this line and on the right trajectory as we can by 12, so that we don't have to worry about having an undersized yeast colony for the final stages of the ferment. And that's when you'll get into like stalled fermentations.
Nick, can we mention one thing on this, since I'm so glad you're talking about it?
Please.
For anyone that sees this and or finds it in the book and they say, boy, it would be great if I could get like an example of one of these so I know what my line should look like. That's not how the AB line works. The AB line works by saying you do a ferment, you record your numbers. If you like the result of that, you now have a line you want to track. But if you go out and see another line, you can't just follow that line. It works specifically to your numbers in terms of your ferment. So some of these, like your koji, your and your yeast, are going to totally be different than someone else's in terms of how it melts and how strong it is. The yada yada yada. Even your water chemistry will change this line. So it's very important to note, just so it's not confusing. And I think you have a BMD curve in there. I thought I saw somewhere, but they all those things are all very much a personal to your brew, to your brewery type thing. But the concept, that is very generic, and it should be applied. But I only mention it because I know a lot of people, myself included, very confused by this when we first started, and I was trying to go like, well, where do I get one of these? How do I find a good line? And that's just not how to think about it. So I just wanted to jump in and make sure that was said for people coming into it.
Sure. Yeah, so I don't have another like blown up BMD, but if you go back to earlier in the presentation, where I showed like a whole brew sheet, there is an example of a BMD curve there. And yeah, 100% agree that that's another worthwhile plot, but that's going to really only help you from batch to batch of the same sake, to see if you are consistent internally. And it's I think it's something that's difficult to put numbers to because it's such a complex moving target that until you are very consistent and have very large large body of batches, it's going to be hard to put worthwhile limits on something like that. You can probably put a worthwhile limit on like your peak Bome. At Odori, say maybe you want to be at a certain level, and then maybe at day 7 or something you want to see, or sorry, day like 3 or 5, you want to have like a number target, a range that you're looking for. But then I would push back just a little bit to say that like for your AB curve, I think if you know where you want to be at the end, then you have a final target. But where you start is going to depend on every batch. So the way that I have this generated in our spreadsheet is that we put in the recipe what our goal and target is, but then Google Sheets will be scanning my daily Bome density results, and then when it reaches a local maxima, it uses that. It automatically makes that the starting point for the AB line, and then from there, that AB line is going to be unique to this batch. But then relatively, we should see a pretty straight line progress between those 2 points.
Yeah. Cool.
Some other things to consider, obviously glucose SMV, we're already talking about that in a bunch of ways, ABV. Acidity and pH are worth recording at the beginning, at the very least, to see if you have any signs of infection, because at that stage, you might be able to ramp up the temperature and get enough alcohol to save the batch. Amino acid, on the contrary, it might be worthwhile if you have a particularly long fermentation to measure amino acid toward the end, because an increase in amino acid at the end of your batch could be indicative of yeast stress and death. And so you might want to start pressing before you have signs of autolysis in your finished batch. Extract is something that I've struggled to grasp with, largely because of translation and misapplication between the term as it's used in brewing, beer brewing and sake brewing. But generally speaking, extract is sort of a correction of your density reading given your alcohol. So it sort of gives you an idea of how much solids there are in your solution, which is representative of resources for your yeast. So if your extract number gets really low, that can be an indicator that your yeast are going to struggle because they won't have enough resources, enough nutrients. So there's not a lot. I don't have a lot of great advice on this number, and I'm still kind of figuring out what worthwhile limits are. So if anybody knows more than me, please share. And then there's a bunch of notes from previous presentations, like Chiaki talked about oxygen exposure to your mash, and like how much stress is worthwhile, and like what a good maximum temperature for your curves are. So the peak temperature limits for your Moromi. And Brandon talked about things like the impact of switching from Kobo Jacomi to Moto and how that affected their fermentation rate, why he prefers to measure glucose directly, and then how to use that as a more impactful finished product metric as well. Let's see, then pressing. So there are a handful of things to consider, but from a prerequisite perspective, again, sanitation is super important here, because you're dealing with a lot of fabric that are just microbial nightmares. So, a Yabuta is like, it scares me second only to my toddler's fingers. Like that thing has so many nooks and crannies that are potential contamination points. So your sanitation procedures for either your Buddha cloths, your Fune bags, your Shizuku bags are paramount. But then you should consider, if you're using a Fune or a Yabuta, what are the pressures that you're going to use? Just for reference for us, when we fill, we have an automatic controller on our press that every time the pressure drops below 15 psi, the pump kicks on and slugs in some more slurry. And then when we squeeze at the inlet side, the pressure kind of starts around 35 or 40 psi at the upper limits of what our sensor can measure before kind of dropping off as the liquid comes out. But if you're using a fune, you'll want to create a pressure curve. You'll have some control over the pressure over time, and with the right controls, you can have very subtle gradations on how much pressure you apply. For the finished product, Kasubuai is a really worthwhile metric to start recording. Just weigh how much Kasu you have left over. Obviously, if you're drip pressing, your Kasubuai is going to be higher than if you're using a fune or a Yabuta. But with internally for any given method of pressing, you should see consistency in your Kasubuai from batch to batch. And then you can probably are striving towards lowering your Kasubuai, so that Kasubuai will be indicative of how dissolved, how much your rice is dissolving and how much product you're getting out. And then this is also a good time to do a diacetyl check right as you start pressing. Is your sake ready to press? Probably worthwhile putting at the top of the list to make sure. If you're getting butter, if Orville Redenbacher's in town, consider waiting a little bit longer. And then some other standards to define on the process. Are you going to do cuts on your effluent on your sake as it comes out? And if you are, how are you going to decide when to make those cuts? Is it going to be based on time? Is it going to be based on volume? Are you going to do a visual inspection and say, okay, now it's coming out of the press clear, so I'm going to take everything that I've already collected and set it aside and keep this as the new cut? Whatever that method is, I'd suggest it, again, shockingly, be defined and consistent. Oxygen exposure, I think, is worth considering to a certain extent. There's varying opinions on how much you should care about this, but if you're going to do drip press, for example, are you going to purge that big open tank that your bags are hanging in? And then sort of as a corollary, how long are they going to hang in that tank? What temperature is that tank being maintained at? Because you're going to have fermentation continue in those bags as you press. For us, this Yabuta that we have is, I lovingly call it my first Yabuta because it is tiny. You can see it's on wheels and you can push it. There's no real risk of me being like squished inside this Yabuta because I can't fit. So what that means is that for our batches, we have to press over the course of 3 days, 3 fills, squeezes, dumps, and refills. So our sake will continue to ferment during that process back in the Moromi tank. So we have to consider the timing of when we start to press. And then are we going to crash the sake? Are we going to let it continue to ferment? Are we going to predict where that final alcohol and SMV is going to land? Those are considerations that you'll have to make given your specific process and your specific equipment. And then, so obviously that's a picture of our Yabuta, and then that graph on the bottom, that's a typical example of a pressure chart. Those spikes that you see on the left-hand side are the filling pressures as the pump is adding more Moromi to the Yabuta, and then that long decline is when you're actually inflating the bladders and starting to squeeze out the last little drops that we can get. And just for reference, we very rarely take cuts because of the fact that we have to fill our Yabuta 3 times for any given batch. Just the logistics of doing that, ending up with like 9 different products for every sake, it would just be a logistical nightmare. So we, more often than not, maybe we'll take the very first part off, but then the rest of it will just blend together. Oh, this is cool. I have a random picture that's off the frame. That's my fault. Sorry. So post pressing, I didn't put nearly as much time into this section because potentially there'll be an opportunity to talk about it in future presentations. But I think just some broad metrics to consider: oxygen exposure broadly. Again, I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but consider it insofar as it might impact your product. And then filtration. You may want to consider defining turbidity if you have the equipment to measure it. So how much haze is left in the finished product. You should consider how long are you going to let the sake settle as Maroka before you filter it. How are you going to pull from the tank to filter? And then depending on the actual filtration equipment that you use, you may have standards for the pressure and the flow of your sake as you're filtering it. So if you're using a filtering media, as it compacts on the filter paper or cloth, it's going to increase the efficacy of the filtration. The cloth is going to have sort of a nominal filtration, but then it's going to increase as more material builds up. So are you keeping a good solid pressure front and flow so that that cake of solids doesn't loosen and then allow more particulate to come back through? For us, this picture that's cut off is a cartridge filter. We're using polypropylene cartridge filters that have absolute micron ratings. So that's less of a concern for us. But we do have to consider, if we're going to regenerate those cartridges, what's our sterilization and storage process for those cartridges between uses? How many times can we use them? How many times can we regenerate them? And how much total volume can we push through them before we need to replace them? And then for pasteurization, I threw this chart on here that I got from Dr. Aoki from the Niigata Prefectural Research Institute. But I think he pulled it from the red sake book that you can buy from Nihon Jyoso Kyokai. But these are examples of time and temp levels for pasteurization to get a 1/10 reduction in your in hyochi bacteria content. So if you expose your sake to 60 degrees C for 19.2 seconds, you will have 1/10 of the hyochi bacteria that you started with, is how you would read this. So to kind of further the discussion in, I think it was Chiaki's presentation about the idea of pasteurization time temp curves. That's a helpful guideline. And then Dr. Aoki also mentioned that in his opinion, you should get to at least 63 degrees Celsius if you're going to be pasteurizing in bottle. So that is also a consideration. And if you want more information about like converting times and temps for pasteurization units and how to calculate like varying temperature over time, you're not going to be at exactly 60 for 19. You're going to be at like 59, then 60, then 61, then 62, and then back down to 61. There's some calculations that you can do, and our thermometer temperature sensor supplier, Craftmetrics, they have a worthwhile write-up on their website about pasteurization temperatures, because one of their products is a pasteurization calculator, like an actual probe that goes into a bottle, and as you bottle pasteurize, it will integrate that curve to determine like how many log deaths of spoilage bacteria genocide you're accomplishing. So if you just do a search for Craftmetrics and pasteurization units, you'll get a worthwhile article. For reference point, we're using a heat exchanger, and we don't have a measure of how long we're able to hold at temperatures, so we're just relying on hitting a terminal temperature. We go up to 65, and then I think we're just kind of banking on our flow being slow enough that we're staying at that temperature for 2 seconds. Then dilutions and additions. I don't have a lot of experience in flavoring additions. But dilutions, one thing I would consider is incorporating that into your sensory panel to test different dilutions for what you prefer. And then consider, are you going to do your dilutions at early in the conditioning stage, or are you going to do it when you are ready to ship your finished product out? In other words, are you going to condition Genshu or diluted? And then bottling, I don't really have a lot of good advice other than what we talked about in the packaging section up at the beginning. So this will be a great presentation for someone else that wants to like take the mantle and do some more work here. 2 hours in, and I've run out of information for you. Last notes for you on finished product and sensory. Obviously, you should already have an idea of what you want your finished product to be in terms of SMV, ABV, acidity, amino acid. Are you going to use amacara, glucose, what have you? But then I would also suggest that you have some consistent method for taking tasting notes, not even just in the finished product, but along the way, so that you have a record of how flavors change during the fermentation, so you can see how they relate to the finished product. You can do some quantifiable measurements for clarity, for color. We talked about using UV vis, taking photos with like a color scale, that kind of thing. But then when it comes to the actual organoleptics and sensory testing, there are 3 categories of tests that you are looking to choose from. There's a discriminatory test where you're trying to decide, are multiple products different in any way? There's a descriptive test to say, how are products different? And then there's an effective test. So like, which one do you like or which one do you prefer? What I can say is that if you are a big enough brewery and you're trying to minimize batch variation, discriminatory tests are going to be very useful. So you can have triangle or tetrad tests where you take, in a triangle test, 3 samples that are blind. One of them, 2 are the same and 1 is different. And then you ask your participants to pick the one that stands out. And then with enough of those tests, you should be able to tell whether or not people can actually perceive it or whether they're just guessing. So if it's significantly more than a third of the time they're getting it right, then there is a noticeable difference. Similarly, there's the tetrad test, which is the same basic concept, except that you have 4 samples, 2 and 2, of 2 different products, and then you ask people to pair the like products together. So these 2 are product A and these 2 are product B. It just gives you a little bit more strength, and you can get some similar results, I think, with a smaller sample size. Then in terms of descriptive testing, there's something called 2AFC, or 2 alternative force choice. This is similar to the triangle test in that you're like trying to see if there's a difference, but what you're doing is you're actually forcing people to say what the difference is. So as an example would be better, I give you 2 different sakes and I say, which of these is sweeter? And you have to answer. You have to pick one. And with enough data from enough different people, you can determine if there is actually a difference in that specific attribute. So a discriminatory test is good if you need to know if just anything is different, or broadly things are different. But a descriptive test like the 2AFC is good if you want to know, am I actually increasing my ethyl caproate, for example? Like, does this taste more appley? Or is this sake, am I getting the thinner body that I want? You have to force people to make a choice. And if enough people say the same thing, then you know whether or not you have actually affected that change. And then preference testing really is kind of a crapshoot. At our level, it would be very hard to do preference testing because you just need a lot of data. So your best bet is to make the sake that you like or that you think your guests will like. But entire industries are built on market research and consumer preferences. So that level of investigation is going to probably be beyond the scale of what we can accomplish. So I did include on this slide a little bit of a decision tree, a framework for like how to choose what type of test you would like. This comes from a book, Food Sensory Practices and Practical Approach. I think I've got it listed here on my next slide, which is additional resources. Sensory evaluation of food principles and practices. So I tried my best anytime I pulled something from a text to include the reference to that text here on this slide. So this is a great spot for you to go to keep learning. And then also specifically some broader groups that are just pools of resource and support for all things quality. And with that, I've taken far too much of your time.
Nick, this was fantastic. This was really, really fantastic. I think obviously there's no audience here, but but I would love to say I know that people are going to watch this for years to come and be really grateful for what you've put together here because every one of these aspects you touched on enough to give people the context. And obviously, there's so much more depth that they can go down and look into each of these. So, I think JJ said it right at first. It's like it's daunting, right?
Yeah.
But I think people can start small, start at the initial origin you talked about, like even just making sure you're tracking your BAME or in that case your gravity, your ABV, your bricks, whatever it may be, just to start some sensory concepts that gets you started, and then
Totally.
from there you just start adding, and if nothing else, the good thing is you've just very well illustrated the sheer complexity of what is involved in this.
Yeah.
And that's not to deter people because I think, yes, you can look at that and say, wow, that's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're really saying is, okay, well, you're not going to start off knowing all of this or doing
Definitely.
all of this. You're going to start off small. You're going to do a couple batches, and realistically, this is something I really struggle with people wanting to do like it all. You mentioned like people going out and saying, "Oh, I'm growing my own spores from scratch," and it's like, okay, like
Yeehaw.
yeah, go nuts. But at the end of the day, it should at least be you look back at the industry in Japan, as soon as it was identified and isolated what was, when you can have an industry specialize in something and take that off your bat, people were like thrilled, yeast, being able to have a consistent product cultured in a lab that is one strain and you're not dealing with all this. Why would you take on that excess journey unless you were specifically trying to do something? I think trying to add more challenge to your day. I mean, I know I plate and I make my own slants and I do that for the sake of a very specific project. But on a day-to-day basis, you're talking on a regular basis, unless you're doing cold storage at a minus 85C, you're taking those out, replating them. If you're doing plates every 3 months, you got to make sure you're doing it much more often than that. If you're doing slants, it's at least every 6 months, and that's for every sample you have for everything. So you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about a whole bunch of stuff. And if you just looked at your presentation alone, that is a lot of time commitment
Totally.
in a given day to doing this stuff. Um, so when people are trying to add on things like, oh, I'm going to save costs by growing my own koji, it's like, well, if it's an experiment and you're just curious, whew, but to add that into the production process of knowing, well, I got to start my spores on September 1st because they need to be ready by September 14th. And then I got to, make sure that they don't get contaminated. It's, whoa, there's a lot there.
Yeah. I
Um,
would say, you know, I'm only where I'm at because have stood on the shoulders of giants, right? Like Blake Richardson is a very tall man, both
right.
literally and metaphorically. But then similarly, like, just because our sake industry is young here, you know, if you're year 3 in your sake brewery, that doesn't mean you need to make sake the same as year 3 at like Ishimoto, you know.
Right.
Take advantage of the 300 years worth of work that they've done,
Right.
and you know, you don't have to take it all on at once.
I think it's one of those things where you go to like a brewery and you see these old school breweries. Even then, even in the old school breweries that are 157 plus years old, you know, they take a sample and you're like, oh, you're gonna smell that? You're gonna like just get a sense of it? And they're like, well, sure, but I'm gonna bring it back and put it in that really expensive analyzer I have from whatever, and
Yeah,
then possibly also put it under this grain, you know, my koji. Oh, you gonna crush it in your hands? I was like, well, no, I'm gonna put it in this moisture thing, and it's gonna a halogen lamp is gonna dry it out and tell me what the moisture is. Oh, you know, so I don't think it's wrong using technology where we can. If for nothing else, there's nothing wrong with understanding what it's like viscerally, tangibly, you know, sensorily.
sure.
But that quantitative number is extremely useful to go back and say, yeah, okay, is my taste off? You might have a cold one day. Are you got to really rely on your sensory 100% of the time? You
Totally.
know, so well, I was going to go into questions, but we are at 3 hours. I think we're gonna stop it here and say, well, we're at 2.5. It's 2.5 hours. But I think this has been one of the most. This is like the neutron star presentations. You really have brought so much information and given people so much to think about. I know for a fact I could go back and watch this like 6 times, and you've done such an amazing amount of work. And since I've been watching you build this presentation over the last month, I know how much has gone into it. So thank you so much for your work on this. You and everyone at Moto E are just a gem. We really appreciate what you've given to the industry. Even just the longevity has allowed other breweries to spawn up and say, "There's more of us. There's a group now." So yeah, thanks for keep doing what you're doing. So
Appreciate that.
we'll
Of
skip
course.
any more questions because honestly, you've really answered most of them, or if all of them. So
Well,
we'll save time for other presenters in the future to take on more of these. As you said, there's topics to take on, and yeah, we'll get you back to your day. So
sounds great.
yeah, thank you so much, and everyone go visit Nick and Blake and everyone else over there at Moto E up in Minnesota. So.
September is a great time. I would avoid February. And if you're headed to
All right.
Japan, I keep telling this, direct flights from MSP to Haneda. It's a great layover town. I'm telling you.
It's not a bad idea, really. It's really not a bad idea.
MSP is a nice airport too. All right.
All
Well,
right.
thank you so much for organizing these. I mean, it's this level of knowledge sharing is, I think, really warranted and needed. And building this community is super important to take sake domestically to the next level. So kudos to you, and I really am honored to be able to represent Moto E and what we've done here.
Thank you, ma'am. All
Of
right.
course.
Well, until next time. Cheers.